And before we look at our text, we can start turning there now. I want to go to the book of Ezra. And I'll explain why we're going to Ezra here. And I left this until the end of last service. I'll say it at the front this time. One of the beauties of Calvary Chapel and the type of church, I guess you could say format, or however you want to say it, that we follow here, is going through the text from chapter 1, verse 1, until you finish the text out. And I've become accustomed to that. That's all that I've ever known. And I've never really fully appreciated how much better I like that format than topical things. And the reason for that is that if we leave off at a verse, we know exactly where we're going to be the next week. And so trying to do something topically means just, whether you sit down and write it out in a year in advance or whatever else, it still nonetheless becomes trying to do topics and themes and quotes and naming of verses and all that stuff. It's just stuff I don't really much like doing. So what we're going to do this morning is kind of an unusual thing for me in that it is topical, but it's going to continue along the lines of where we just left off in Zephaniah. And we're going to tie in over this week and the next two after this what happened when they were taken away in their captivity, what we've been studying about on Sunday morning. What Zephaniah had said would happen has happened. But what we find is that God, just as he was true to his word and said that he would do, begins to bring them back into the land. And so we look at it in three parts. There was the returning to the land, and it was primarily done, or the person that's the face of it is a man named Zerubbabel. And after Zerubbabel did what he had done, then it came in, and in pretty close succession, it was Nehemiah and then Ezra. And each of them had a particular thing that they were tasked to do. So we want to look at those, and there's good application to the church in this. So he says it's going to be 70 years. So shortly after the work of Zephaniah, and when Josiah dies, not long after, a decade, maybe a little bit more, in comes the beginnings of the problems with Babylon. They are ultimately completely defeated, taken away in captivity, and then ultimately come back. What we read here in Ezra, though this book has his name, the first 6 chapters aren't really even dealing with him. Ezra doesn't come into the narrative until chapter 7. But what he gives us is all the run-up until God brought him to the land. He tells you about how it started at the beginning. And so we get it from a man named Cyrus is where it all begins. Now, if we believe the writings of Josephus, he's the one who is credited with saying that a presentation of the book of Isaiah was once shown to King Cyrus. And when Isaiah wrote, it's in chapter 44 at verse 28. He's mentioned by name, Cyrus is. And he's also mentioned again in the very next verse, chapter 45, verse 1. He's mentioned by name, King Cyrus. And he's referred to as being a shepherd and as being a servant. And so God speaks of him and said, he's going to bring my people back. And it goes on for chapters of describing it, but he says he's going to bring it back. Now, that doesn't necessarily sound all that interesting until you find out that Isaiah wrote that a couple of hundred years before the events, by name. But that's not unusual, because God did the same thing with Josiah. Mentioned him by name before he was born as well. So God doesn't have a problem with that. He's there before and after and during, and he's outside of time, so to tell you the name is no big deal. For him, anyway. So he tells him. He speaks of him before this happens. And so Cyrus, according to Josephus, historians, was really compelled in his own mind and heart to say, well, if God said so, then I should do so. Well, chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Ezra says this, Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, that it might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia. That's an important part. Because whether we believe Josephus or whatever else, notice who it is that stirs Cyrus. It's the Lord who stirs in his heart. Why? Because God's the one keeping the calendar. 70 years, it's time. So he moves upon a Persian king. Notice that he says Persian, not Babylonian. So think about what's happened. Though the Babylonians were the ones who came in and destroyed Jerusalem and took them captive, By this time, Nebuchadnezzar's long since gone, defeated by Cyrus and the Medo-Persians. Now here is the king over this Persian Empire, including Babylon. And how do we know that this is his first year as far as that is concerned? Because the promise that he makes, it entails sending back the people that were in Babylon. And he sends them back with the goods and the things necessary to rebuild. So this is his first year as the king there in Persia, but the first year of king over this empire. So it says in verse 2, "Thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given to me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of his people? May his God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel, which is in Jerusalem." So there is the decree. Go build the house of God at Jerusalem, the same one that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. You have been tasked, you people, and I will send you to do so. And notice he even realizes that God has tasked me to send you to do this. This is his decree. Verse 4, "And whoever is left of in any place where he dwells, let the men of his place help him with silver and gold, with goods and with livestock, besides the freewill offerings for the house of God, which is at Jerusalem." And then you notice at verse 5 down to verse 11, it begins to show how he's taking those things that were plundered during Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon's time and begins to give them back to them so that they would have the things implement-wise to do the worship like they're supposed to. So what that implies is two things. A place where they would be able to worship as God told them, but then also the rebuilding of the temple. It's the focal point of that place. Everyone would know, and by just looking at it, they would know that there's an identity to it. We have this in some small measure even here at this place, because we say that we go to church. Well, we know what it looks like from the outside. We know what it looks like from the inside. It has the four walls, it has the lights and everything else. We know what it looks like. Even when we're gone from here, we can tell you the layout of it, what it looks like. Great, that's the building. The church itself, though, is part of the identity. It's where the brothers and sisters come together. We spend time in the Word, we fellowship with one another, and we grow in our understanding and our knowledge of who God is. That's what happens inside the walls. But this church, if these walls were to crumble, would still be able to meet. But these walls give us that identity. We are part of this church at Old Path. Okay, great. We get all of that. What they were supposed to do with both things, build the temple, the correct kind of worship that had been done as God had prescribed before, but they build the walls around it. It's the place where they would meet corporately. Very simple. Doesn't sound all that detailed, right? Chapter 2 is where we find out that they begin to go. Verse 2 is where we find out that Zerubbabel is the top of that list. So chapter 2 deals with giving us the names of all the people that are supposed to go, and they get back there, and then chapter 3 tells us, Chapter 3, verse 1 tells us, "When the 7th month had come, the children of Israel were in the cities, and the people gathered together as one man at Jerusalem. And then Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and the brethren of the priest," and it gives us the list of who those people are. They get together, and, as we see in verse 3, the fear came upon them because of the people and those in the countries. They set a pillar on its bases, and they offered burnt offerings to the Lord, both in the morning and the evening, burnt offerings. So they begin to put back in what are the prescribed offerings, like they're supposed to be. But notice that there's a fear that's upon them, and so they're not able to function as they want to, but they do so in a way of, okay, well, at least we can start the beginning of this. They, with good intention, it seems, start to put together the foundations for the temple and all the rest of it, but it's not coming to pass. They do the minimum, and they take care of that. Chapter 4 begins to talk about the opposition that takes place. Chapter 5 is after the opposition and appeal made all the way to Persia. They are given the decree to go back to work on the temple. Chapter 5 gives us that. And then chapter 6 brings us to a king named Darius. And Darius is able to say, just like Cyrus said, so I reaffirm the decree, begin to build. So this is what we get in the first 6 chapters as we go through Ezra. Now that brings us to the prophet Haggai. Now, if you are remembering where Zephaniah was, those little small prophets, go back there, and Haggai is the very next book. I want to go there because this picks up what we just read. And here's where it starts to become a very interesting application to the church, to us as we who read. Now again, this is their history. This happened with them. But what we can learn from them is that we don't fall into the same problems that they fell into. We know this. Complacency is kind of the way that men do what they do, men and women. It's just a human kind of a thing. We know that that was talked about in chapter 1 of Zephaniah. Remember where he said, when I come into Jerusalem, I'm going to do so as with a lamp or a lantern. It means that there's no place for you to hide. And I'm going to come to those people who are stuck in their complacency. And they're going to say, God will do no evil, nor will he do any good. That was what they were being told by their prophets, and that's what they believed. Now imagine being these people who came back for the very first time. They've never seen it with their own eyes. They've known about it because they've been told about it during their captivity, and now they're going back to their place of their origins, or of their people. They're going back for the first time. Now, if you've ever been to Israel, you would know that Jerusalem is set up on one of the hills, so there would be an ascent to it. You would know when you were getting close because you'd be able to see it. Now, what you're going to see is the ruins of what was once something magnificent, but it lay in ruin. So if that's the case, you can imagine the exhilaration that must be there, and at the same time, the brokenness of realizing that if you knew what was said during Zephaniah, you would say, we were lied to. Because we were told God's indifferent, he doesn't care. We're indifferent, he's indifferent, everything's fine, he won't do any good or he won't do any evil, and yet you lay your eyes on the fact that God judged when you thought he wouldn't. So here they are. They come back. Haggai picks this up for us. Notice it says, in the 2nd year of King Darius, in the 6th month, on the 1st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by Haggai, the prophet, to Zerubbabel. There's the important part. Now, they've come back into the land, right? Now, what has happened, and it's very subtle, when you have to start to say, okay, great, here we have some very, very direct numbers. We know the first year of Cyrus because it's a historical one. We know when he would have defeated Babylon. And we know when Darius would have taken the throne as well. And so we're looking at basically 20 years. 20 years. Now, you would figure that in 20 years you could probably get something built that you were sent to do in the first place. That was what you were sent to do, right? But they weren't able to get it done. Now, they would say, well, did you not read chapter 4? We had a problem and they were giving us opposition. We had to appeal this all the way back and, they were going through the normal channels. There are some times we probably forget to say, hey, God, there's a problem here. We're getting opposition. You probably could have cut at least 10 years out of the project. Instead, they go through the normal channels. Whatever that may be, what we do know by this time, they were settled in this. Look at what is said. It's staggering. Verse 2. Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying, this people says, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. So here's God's way of saying, I've been listening to what you guys have been saying. You're saying this, the time has not yet come that we should build God's house. 20 years isn't enough to start. 20 years, really? So this is what the people are saying. Now God has his chance to answer. Look at what he says. So the word of the Lord came to Haggai the prophet. So here's God's reply. Is it time for yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses and this temple lie in ruins? You get the answer? Oh, there's no time to build God's house, but you have paneled homes. That's his way of saying it's not just little shacks. You're not living in a refrigerator box. You've taken the time to build your own house. You've got a place for you to stay, but the priority of God's house is completely a secondary issue to you. We've got the altar. We're able to do the sacrifices. We're doing it morning and evening. We're keeping the sacrifices, and we're keeping the holidays. And what's God want? Well, does God need a house in which to dwell? No. Nothing can contain him. He's already said that. But what it was a recognition that the people were mindful of who he was, giving to him a place where he could be seen and worshiped and welcomed. That was the issue. And if that place does not exist, it's not that it's not the four walls. It just says more about the heart, that the people don't see a need for it. And this became the issue. So we read on. Look at what God says. Boy, this is chilling. Let's read verse 4 again. Is it time then for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and yet this temple lie in ruins? His way of basically, in the modern context, saying, oh, you've been watching plenty of the do-it-yourself channel. But mine? Now look what he says. Now therefore, because of that, here's what the Lord of hosts says. Consider your ways. Wow. That is a stinging rebuke. Have you forgotten? You were in your captivity and you're starting in the same exact direction that got you there in the first place. Complacency, it's all about us, it's not about him. We're at least doing the bare minimum, but we've got our own things to worry about. Well, notice what he says, verse 6. You have sown much, but you bring in little. You eat, but you don't have enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put them into a bag with holes. That's his way of saying nothing that you touch prospers. You want all the benefits of being brought back into your land, but you don't even want to pay attention to the one who brought you back, the one who promised to do so. He gave you every conceivable benefit. You rebelled, you sinned, you were judged, but God restored you, just like he said he was. It's that repeating cycle of things. And now here they are in the land, and they're getting back into the exact same kind of complacency. Notice in verse 7, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways, now for the second time. Considering your ways is very simply saying, stop for a moment, inventory everything, and look at where you are. You're starting down the exact same road of complacency that leads to the idea of folly. Remember, Zephaniah tells us that they were mixing the worship of God with the worship of foreign gods and idolatry, and didn't even know the difference between the two. They had become so corrupt. That was the beginning of the problems, and God ultimately judged them, and it was 70 years gone. Now here they are back in the same place, and rather than say, let's not repeat the last time, what we did the last time, they're on the same exact path. Look at verse 8. Go up to the mountains, bring wood, build the temple, that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified, says the Lord. There's the issue. If you've got to take the time to put the work into it, you'll know what it is and why it is. And it will be a nice little focus for your mind. Now, I've met people that say, well, the Bible doesn't tell us that we have to go to church. You know, that's kind of true. You find it in the book of Hebrews that it says, don't forsake the fellowship of the brethren. Okay, so great. I'm not going to have that argument. I will just say to those people, I've noticed something very interesting about them. Their personal fellowship with other believers is really heavily diminished. And ordinarily, most of those people who will make that argument do so, and their lives are really not dedicated towards the Lord. They use it as an excuse. And the funny thing, you've probably heard this joke before. Well, I wouldn't want to go to church. It's full of hypocrites. Well, great. If you find one without one, don't join it because you'll ruin it. That's the answer to that one. So the problem becomes that it is an excuse not to be together. Here in this case, he says, go and build it so it's a place that I can have pleasure in and that there is fellowship. You're not just going through the religious motions, but it will genuinely be a place of getting together. Verse 9, you looked for much, but indeed it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Says the Lord of hosts. Answer, because of my house, that it lies in ruins, while every one of you runs to his own place. Therefore the heavens above will withhold dew, the earth will withhold its fruit. For I called a drought on the land and the mountains, on the grain and the new wine and the oil, on whatever the ground brings forth, on the men and the livestock, and all the labor of your hands. Remember, he's in control of all of it. I'm the one who brought you here. I'm the one who will be with you, but it's a two-way street here. He's not going to impose upon them anything, but he says, I brought you back here so that we could reestablish things as they should be. And yet they had become complacent and they had let it all fall apart. Now notice what happens. Verse 12. So Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, And Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, with all of the remnant of the people of Israel, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent them. And the people feared the presence of the Lord. Sometimes it takes just a very sobering warning. And of course, it's because of the authority of God himself. And each one of these people are having to deal with all of those consequences. You know, you're right. We labor for everything and it comes to nothing. We try to do things to quench our thirst and we're never quenched. We try to find ways to eat and we're never full. We put money in our bags because we've earned it and it falls right through out the other side. We get it. Now it's been brought to our attention, and so they turned. So then, verse 13, then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, spoke the Lord's message to the people, saying, I am with you, says the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel and all of those other guys, and the remnant of the people. And so they came and they worked on the house of the Lord of hosts, their God, and on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. Now, it would still take another roughly 4 years to complete the task. So can you imagine, from the going out of the decree to do it, Cyrus sends them back, it's 25 years until they finally get around to the task, and only because God says, what are you guys doing? I've given you 20 years. And he answers his own question. I know what you've been doing, and I even hear what you've been saying. What you've been saying is it's not time, but it is time for you to build your own stuff. Now look at mine, it lays in ruin. Now go get some wood and build this place that I can have pleasure in it. And that you will be reminded every time that you see it that this is the place, this is the house of the Lord, and this is where we fellowship with him and one with another. This is what he asks. So what's the application of the church? Because it's not about this building, because again, this building can crumble, and the day will come when it won't even stand anymore, which is kind of amazing, because when you look at the construction of it, it's kind of bulletproof. Did you guys know that all this stuff here, that's just facade? Those are I-beams up there. This thing it's been here since the 30s, and think of all the earthquakes that have hit. There's not even a crack in the walls. This is a tank, basically, is what this is. Great. Let's call it an ark. But it won't float. But it is, nonetheless, just a building, and nothing will last forever. So the facade is nothing. The church is it's a whole different thing. The church is comprised of living human beings that are regenerated by the Spirit of the living God. And when he indwells the believer, you become his abode. So if you want to make the proper application to this, is there a place there we gather together to worship? Absolutely. We have this place. But we also recognize that the promise that Jesus had given to us is that when he would die and that when he would resurrect and ascend, that he would send the Holy Spirit who would be in us. So then there becomes the dwelling place of God. Now take the application from this and say, what's the condition of the house? Because all of us have to look at this. And it's not an easy thing, but let's take a look at something that we read from Matthew as we conclude this morning. In Matthew's Gospel, let's turn to chapter 6. Now, chapter 6, firmly in the middle of the part where we're reading, it's right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, what they call the Mount of Beatitudes when we go back to Israel. If it's not exactly where we go to, it's right there in those hillsides. There's really not much question. And it's an interesting thing. It's subtle, but once you're there, if you see it with your own eyes, you'll go, ooh, I understand why he made those two analogies, because it's right there in front of your eyes. But what he's done at this point, he's already talked to them about, here's how you pray. When you pray, you don't repeat this one. You pray something like this from your own heart, your own mind. Engage yourself in praying to God, not just repeating words. Now, he goes from that point to talking about the things that people become concerned about. Verse 19, don't lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust destroy. So he goes on to those things about saying, have a heavenly kind of a perspective, and don't be so encumbered with the things of earth. Don't be so consumed with the things here. It's important for us to recognize something too, though. God doesn't have a problem with material things necessarily. if those material things don't become a situation that become more important to the person than their relationship with God. So he doesn't call all of us to a vow of poverty, but he doesn't call all of us to be rich. Forget what you hear on television from all those people. They're trying to sell you something. Look at what the Word of God has to say. The riches and the things of possession became a problem to those people at the exclusion of their walk with God. That was the issue. That's where everything began to go horribly wrong for them. So here Jesus says, you can be all concerned about the things of life, but you shouldn't be. Instead, an eternal perspective is a far better way. Look at verse 25. So because of that, where he started at verse 19 to 24, you can read those things. There are a number of examples that he gives. The therefore is the important part. So that being the case, therefore, I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what will you put on it. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? See, here's a parallel. This is like when God said to them, I hear what you guys are saying. It's not time to build God's house, but we got time to build ours. Same kind of a thing. So he's saying, you're worried about all kinds of stuff. But look at what he says in verse 26. So look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor do they reap. They don't gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they? Which of you by worrying can add a cubit to his stature? Is worrying going to somehow change your condition? So then he says in verse 28, so why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor do they spin, and yet I say to you that even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is today and then tomorrow is thrown into an oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Now here's an amazing thing. If you ever go to visit there, and if you go with me, I'm going to tell you in advance what I'm going to say to you. Because we're going to look through this and a couple of other things that he taught at the Sermon on the Mount. And then at some point, I'm going to go ahead and point to the hillsides around and say, do you notice what you see out there? Because we go in the springtime. All that you're going to see is fields filled with green and wild flowers. They just happen on their own. And then I'm going to say, you probably didn't notice a single one of them, but I want you to listen and look all around the property here and see how many of these birds you can see, and do you hear them? And then all of a sudden you realize they've been here all that time and I never took notice of them. And yet there they are. So here Jesus, I believe, was able to gesture when he says, well, look at the lilies of the field. Take a look. The birds, listen to them. You can hear them. You can see them. You can take in all these things that are right there in front of your eyes. You probably never taken notice of them, and I want you to know they happen because God makes them happen. You have nothing to do with it. And yet here you are so concerned about your here and now. So, what do we take away from this? Therefore, verse 31, don't worry, saying what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear? For all these things the Gentiles seek after. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all of these things. But here's what I want you to do. That's my paraphrase. Seek first the kingdom of God. Seek his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. Everything you were concerned about, make that God's concern, not yours. Make your concern him and his kingdom. Let him worry about the other kind of details. Remember, he clothes entire fields, and he sees to the needs of birds that you've never even paid attention to. I'm going to ask you to do this today. Every once in a while I'll remember to do this, because even now, did any of you notice a bird since you got up this morning to go into the house, or leaving the house to come here? A couple. Not many. The rest of this day, if you can be mindful to do it, pay attention to every bird that you see and every one that you hear. They are all over the place. You see them everywhere, but you never pay attention to them because they're just there. Then look at what he says in verse 34. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry of its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Now, is he saying here, don't pay attention to anything, don't even worry about tomorrow, none of that stuff? No. That's not what he's saying. He's talking about the people who are so concerned about things down the road that they're not even paying attention to things today. So having plans and all the rest of that, not a problem. He knew what he was going to be doing for the rest of his time here on earth. He had planned those things. He was there when it was all put together in the beginning. He knew what he would be doing. So the idea of having plans is not the issue. Having plans independent of paying attention to the things of the day and not even seeking God's counsel for today or tomorrow is the issue. Self-sufficiency is the problem. It was happening with them as we studied through Haggai, or if it's Ezra. When we look next week and it's Nehemiah, or in week 3 when it is Ezra, these are all people who had tasks put before them, things that God had asked. Sometimes they were really good about doing it exactly as God had said, and other times they needed reminders. Sound like us? Application. Learning the lessons of history so that we don't repeat them ourselves. Let's stand.